In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. So, standing here before you, and I'll be honest, inside I am fatigued. We have a newborn in the house who have now ruled the house, and so things have been a little bit tired. So this idea of fatigue is coming from a very personal place right now. But although I may be experiencing fatigue from a little bundle of joy, many of us experience fatigue throughout life. Throughout our life, we begin to, we go through life, and instead of living life, life lives us. We feel like we're a puppet. That life tells me to do this, so I must do this. Life tells me to do this, so I got to do that. I should go here. I should do that. Like, we begin to feel tired. We begin to feel as though life has become very mundane, or life has become tasteless. We begin, and all these feelings of feeling tired, that life is mundane, life has no taste or flavor, naturally leads to another question. And the question that we commonly ask, and we ask like, well, what's the purpose of this? And we begin to ask God, like, God, is this really what you had planned for my life? Because the stories that I read in the Bible aren't necessarily matching up to the life that I'm living right now. So we begin to ask a very simple and a very honest question to God. It's like, is this what you had intended? Because I am dying and suffocating inside from the mundane life that I'm living, from the tasteless life that I'm living, from the fatigue of life that I have. It's a common question that many people go through. And I've had this conversation in person, and I've also had it in large groups. So there's not a person here, myself included, that doesn't, I think at one point in life, just ask God, is this really what you had planned for me? Because I followed you, and I kind of thought there was something different in store, but I'm coming up, and things aren't matching up. And so the question is, well, how do we get to this place? How do we get to this life that feels mundane, that we feel tired, that we ask, like, well, what's the purpose of this? We have to understand how and why we end up in a place like this. And so in today's gospel, which comes from Matthew 12, verses 22 through 37, Jesus is sitting around and he heals a demon-possessed man. And the Pharisees around him begin to say, well, the only way this man can cast out a demon is from the power of Beelzebub, who is the ruler of the demons. So Jesus healed a demon-possessed man. He performed an exorcism. And the Pharisees around said, the only way this man could have done this is through the power of Beelzebub, who is the ruler of the demons. And Jesus, being there, perceived their thoughts. And he wanted to address it. And this is where we see Jesus, the lawyer and the logical person, coming out. And he starts to go through a little kind of discourse. All right? And I'll quickly read it. And it says, Jesus said to them, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself will not stand. And if Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? And if I cast out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your sons cast them out? I want to stop and I want to look at, well, what was Jesus saying? It sounds nice. He clearly refuted what they were saying, but let's go through the argument. So the first couple of lines that he says is, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself cannot stand. So he essentially said, well, wait a second. Well, let's just look at history. We've been around, and we know what has happened to great kingdoms, great dynasties. Great dynasties fall not from the outside, but from the inside. So he looked historically. Well, historically, can things that are divided stand? and Pharisees, being students of history and students of the law, probably would agree and say, yeah, well, we can look back in history and say, okay, great kingdoms have fallen because division and jealousy and greed from the inside tears the kingdom apart. So he looked from a historical standpoint. And he said, okay, well, here's a historical standpoint. Let's take it one step closer to home. I'm sure many of you have come across households, he's talking Pharisees, but we could also think to it to ourselves. Many of you have come across households where the husband and the wife are at odds. And because of that, a household falls apart. We've seen it, some of us have experienced it, and we know that when there's division inside the house falls apart. And even just before the house, he said cities. We know that cities can be divided as well. Countries can be divided because there's division within the country. When we look historically, Jesus is starting to point out a principle, and the principle is things that are divided cannot stand. He took it from a historical standpoint. He brought it a little bit more closer to home, looking at cities. And then he really looked at the individual and the family structure, and he said, even in the family structure, where there is division, things will fall. All right? So that was his first argument. He was establishing a principle that when things are divided, it cannot stand. That was the principle. We need to hold on to that. He takes that principle and he drives the point home. Next, he says, all right, another reason why your argument that I'm casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub is wrong is because if you are acknowledging that Beelzebub is present, okay, and is doing work in this present life, then you're acknowledging that his kingdom still exists. You're saying that I'm casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub. So you're acknowledging that Beelzebub and his legion of devils exists, that his kingdom exists. Well then, if I'm within that kingdom, the very act of me casting out another demon should have divided and made this kingdom crumble. But the fact that you're acknowledging it means that this kingdom of Beelzebub still exists. So again, their logic was faulty. And then he kind of threw it on them. He's saying, wait a second, I'm not the only one in this area that does exorcisms. Some of your Jewish brothers, they do exorcisms too. It was common at that time. And so he said, what are you saying about your own brethren? Are you saying that they are casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub? So he said, you're casting condemnation and judgment on your own brothers by the statement that you made that I'm casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub. So Jesus took their statement and he broke it apart. He looked historically, he took it a little bit closer, looked locally, and then he made it apply personally, and then he extrapolated the principle, which things that are divided cannot stand, and he continued the argument. And so, Jesus, in this gospel, established a very important principle for all of us. For all of us. And he showed, and the strength of a principle comes in its ability to be applied in every area and every aspect of life. A principle is something that can be applied on a great scale and on a small scale. So his principle was, things that are divided cannot stand. But see, we need to be able to take that principle and now say, okay, I need to apply this principle personally. I need to be able to apply the principle personally. And so the personal application now becomes, when my life is divided, I cannot stand. When my life is divided, I cannot stand. So what does that mean exactly when my life is divided? On a very broad term, what it means when I have chosen, okay, the most common way we can apply it personally, not the only way, but a common way to apply this principle personally, is to say, when I have chosen to have a secular life and a sacred life, I've now created division in my own life. When I choose to have what is secular in my life, be separate from what is sacred, meaning my relationship with God. When the two are separated, I have created division in my own life. Let me give you some examples of how we see how, commonly people have separated the secular and the sacred. All right? Some of us look at our jobs and we say, well, my work, my career is essentially to bring in financial support. We no longer see our jobs and our mission, our jobs as our mission, as a mission field. When God said, you are the salt of the earth, well, what do you do with salt? You sprinkle salt. Some of us land in office buildings, some of us landed in schools, some of us landed every which way to be salt in that place. But when now I look at my job and I say, well, my job is to bring financial support, but my service is on the weekend, we've now separated secular from sacred. If you take it, you can apply it to school. If I look and say, well, my academic life, well, that's academic. It doesn't have anything to do with my spiritual life. We begin to separate secular from the sacred. Now it's much harder that eventually when we get to our careers to say, God, well, what do you want to do with my career? You've given me this gift of education. We are in a country where education is easy to get a hold of. It's a God-given gift. But when I separate the secular from the sacred, then eventually I end up with an education that I'm using for one purpose, but I have a completely different life. We separate secular from sacred. Another example. Many of us sometimes think, I've gotten into this discussion with several people, think that, well, the Bible teaches certain things, but I should keep the biblical things to myself, and when I go to vote on certain social issues, I shouldn't impose my beliefs on other people. I shouldn't impose my beliefs on other people. It's another way we begin to separate secular life from sacred life. When I think that biblical truths that God has spoken to me as my moral authority only pertain to me and not everybody else, I begin to separate my secular life from my sacred life. And the list goes on and on. I had a conversation with a financial person one time who was struggling in life, and he's just like, I just don't see the purpose of what I'm doing. I just, within my job, it's not like you're a priest. You get to go, talk about God all the time. And at the time, I didn't give him this answer, but I thought about it now after meeting certain people, and I realized, wait a second. The Bible talks about money more than almost any other topic in the Bible. This man has more guidance on how to use his career and his, gift of managing money to do great things for God. But what has happened in his life is he has separated the secular from the sacred. And so now he's in a career that he thinks is just so mundane and boring and has no point. Don't you love it when you hear about governors and different people who, when a controversial issue is coming up to be voted on, it kills me inside when I read one time a governor saying, don't worry, to the public, I won't let my Catholic religion influence the way I vote on this issue. I was like, great. Essentially, we have a person in office who is divided in himself, who thinks he should vote one way because of popular opinion, but inside he believes and lives something different. It's a divided person. Our government is filled of divided people, which is why nothing gets done, because we separate the sacred from the secular. Jesus is our perfect example. He never separated secular from the sacred. The sacred aspect of who he was the Son of God. But he himself never separated his sacred from the secular. The humanity he took on from this world was never separated from the sacred aspect of his life. And actually the two were joined so perfectly. When do we see that Jesus in a crowd all of a sudden acted based on popular opinion? based on what the crowds wanted to hear, based on what the individual in front of him wanted to hear. He never separated the secular from the sacred. His humanity was never separated from his divinity. It would be a very dangerous thing for our salvation if Jesus ever separated his humanity from his divinity, because the humanity would have fallen. So when we begin to compartmentalize our life into the idea of secular and this is sacred, essentially what we are doing is we put our life with God in a box. We put our life with God in a box. We put chains on it. We put parameters saying you exist in this area and you are not allowed to come out of this area because, well, this is secular and you, Lord, are sacred. Well, slowly over time, what happens is we extinguish the vision that God has for us as individuals. We slowly extinguish the vision that God has for us and has for our lives. And so how do we know we begin to extinguish that vision? Well, we begin to end up with lives that we're tired. We begin to end up with lives that we begin to ask, well, what's the purpose of what I'm doing? This career that I've established, this academic accomplishments, what are the purpose? What are they bringing me to? When we begin to ask those questions, it's because we've kept the sacred in a box. And slowly and surely, we've begun to extinguish the vision that God has for us. And the vision only comes to life when we fully join our secular and sacred lives and say that there's no division. When we begin to take out the walls that separate my life with God from the life that I live with everybody else, then we begin to step into the vision that God has for your life and my life. But as long as we live divided, then we live dry. We live mundane. We live without purpose. But when we join together the secular and the sacred, and make them one, then what we do in this world has new meaning. We no longer see our offices as just means for finance, but we see them as a field for God's seeds. Sure, it seems scary. Well, what would happen if I really began to share my faith in my work? Would people look at you funny? Yes, they would look at you funny. Would people dislike you for some of the views that you have? Yes, people may dislike you for some of the views that you have. But life begins to have a greater purpose, though. And when we don't have a greater purpose, a vision that goes above us, then we will never have the motivation or the encouragement or the strength to deal with the obstacles that lay before us in whatever area of life, wherever you are in life. Who of God's people in the Bible had an easy time preaching the word? I don't know. When we look at the apostles during this Feast of the Apostles, which of them had an easy road to preaching the gospel? None of them. Why did they put up with all the things that happened to them? Why did they put up with the stonings? Why did they put up with being cast out? Why did they put up with being shipwrecked? Why? Because they saw what could be. They saw life, they saw a vision. They saw the vision that God wanted for their life. And so their life slowly took a progression. They looked and say, wait, this is a life that could be. And from a life and seeing what could be, they began to dwell in that and say, wait a second, this is what my life should be. This is what God is telling me should be my life. And so they move from, well, this is what life with God could be, this is what it should be, and then we move into the final stage of, this is what it will be. But getting to this is what my life will be with God takes the merging of secular and sacred, so that there's no difference. It doesn't matter what situation in life I am. It doesn't matter what class of society I'm around. It doesn't matter what culture I'm around. It doesn't matter if I'm at work or I'm here at church. Because we've now become one united person. We've moved from a divided to united individual. And only at the point of uniting, or on that process of uniting our lives, making it one life and not the life of different hats, do we begin to take on and see God's vision for us. But it requires that commitment. If you wanted to go parachuting, what are your steps? Well, you get on your vest, you go in the plane. The plane goes up. Have you parachuted yet? No. You only parachute when you jump. You don't say, I'm parachuting inside the plane. That doesn't work. If you want to go scuba diving, do you scuba dive inside the boat or do you scuba dive outside the boat? No, you only scuba dive and experience the beauty of underneath the ocean floor when you're there. But when we never take that final step, when we never say, okay, I'm going to jump out of the plane, never say, okay, I'm going to jump out of the boat, never say, like, okay, I'm going to unite the secular and the sacred and live as if there's no difference, then we never see the beauty that's on the other side. And what we're left with is a mundane life, a life without purpose, a life without vision. God has casted a personal vision for each of us. There's not a person here that God, in His infinite ability, has casted a unique vision for all of us. But it takes that unification. Jesus in His gospel said, you're either with me or you're not. You're either gathering with me or you're scattering. He said you're either jumping out of the plane or you're staying in the plane. You're either in the boat or you're scuba diving. He left us with no choice. He said this is what it is. When I came as united, humanity and divinity. I lived as if my humanity and divinity were united and inseparable. I spoke, I taught, not differentiating the two. But can we live like that? It's a challenge. But it sure beats a mundane life. It sure beats a life without purpose. It sure beats being tired. But it doesn't come without its step. It doesn't come without jumping out of the plane. It doesn't come without getting out of the boat. And it doesn't come without breaking the walls down that separate our secular from our sacred lives. And glory be to God forever. Amen.